so that I often felt like an honorary student at UTK.
I thought they were.
So where he was serving there as the professor and simultaneously serving as the director of Highlander Center for Research and Education. His book, Power and Powerlessness, served as a foundational scholarship for my research. I'm not alone in valuing his research as evidenced by the 5 awards and over 35,000 copies of this book that has been sold. We all wait in anticipation, and there's actually some sheets here, some of you are anticipating, we'll let you get it after the presentation, his revisiting of the work, Power and Powerlessness, in his new book, Power and Just Transitions. Dr. Gaventa's Appalachian roots run deep. He is originally from East Tennessee and did his undergraduate degree at Vanderbilt University, where he worked with the Student Health Coalition. Many of the members of that coalition are here with us today and have their own session at this conference. Dr. Gaventa is very involved in activist work in the region, including in the founding of SOCM, which is now known as the Statewide Organization for Community Empowerment. Had a different meaning when we first started, but that's the current name. He's continued to do similar work around the world, creating a positive Appalachianization of the world. He served as an educator, facilitator, and trainer in over 20 countries. Taking a collaborative partnership approach, he has organized and led several large-scale research programs and social action networks. In addition to Highlander, he has served as a leader of civil organizations, including chair of Oxfam, Great Britain. He has a particular interest in linking education and research to development of practice and social change. Please give an enthusiastic Appalachian welcome to Dr. John Gaventa.
Thanks, Ada. I'm going to have to change this. I did say I want to thank my former PhD student at UT. My memory has failed me. But thank you so much for having me back. Congratulations to the organizing committee and to Tennessee Tech, because it's a great conference. And well done. And for me, it's personally bringing together many different networks in this room. I see former students from the UK and from here. I see former activist colleagues. I see fellow academics from whom I've learned a great deal. It's a wonderful privilege to be here, and thank you. This is the 48th Appalachian Studies Conference. 47 years ago, in 1978, I had the opportunity to give the first keynote address in Berea, where the conference was convened by Steve Fisher and Royal Jones. So preparing this speech was easy. I just copied the old one. I again addressed the 25th anniversary in Helene, Georgia in 2003, organized by Pat Keever and Helen Lewis. So it's good to be back with you again and to reflect on the history and future of Appalachian studies in this difficult time. However, I have to admit that when I first received the invitation and told people I'd be coming to Cookeville for the Appalachian Studies Conference, people said, is Cookeville, Tennessee, part of Appalachia? And of course it is. Politically, Putnam County, where we are, and surrounding counties are included in the 423 counties of what ARC defines as Appalachia, located in southern Appalachia. We think, and Rich Kirby was saying, he thinks this is the first Appalachian Studies Conference held in Central Time Zone, though. Geographically, I'm reminded by Professor Troy Smith here at Tennessee Tech that we're on the western end of the Cumberland Plateau, also part of the Appalachian Mountain Chain. Socioeconomically, the area shares many of the traits of other southern Appalachian counties. A history of small manufacturing, including now closed coal, textile mills, agriculture, and even mining, especially in Grundy or Fentress County. Like parts of Appalachia, development has been uneven. We probably came in on the major interstate, which has attracted growth along the corridor, but with several areas still nearby or still designated by IRC as distressed zip codes and communities. Culturally, we have here across the region a rich history of music and other arts, many of which we're experiencing here at the conference. For me personally, it's important to note that Highlander Center, where I worked for many years, was founded as the Highlander Folk School in 1932 in Grundy County, just to the south of here, where Ada is from. Miles Horton, one of the founders, used to tell the story of coming in the very early days to support miners in the famous strike in Wilder, a company town in nearby Fentress County. The dispute was between the Fentress Coal and Coke Company of Nashville and the United Mine Workers Union 467, which was the only labor union south of the Ohio River in 1932. Miles witnessed terrible conditions, including violence against the miners, hunger and homelessness, and he began to write about what he saw, sending reports to newspapers across the country. On one of the visits, according to Miles, and we therefore have to take a bit of solace, he was arrested by a member of the National Guard and held in jail for 8 hours before being released. His charge, coming here, getting information, going back, and teaching it. A wonderful mission, which I have always thought should become the slogan for Appalachian Studies. Coming here, getting information, going back, and teaching it. Now I start with a short reflection about where we are because the understanding of place is foundational to the notion of Appalachian Studies. But while place is important, in my remarks tonight I also want to reflect on our place in this region, while unique, is also so similar to and intertwined with rural parts, many rural places in other parts of the world. Situating the local within the global is important in my own history. While a 7th generation Appalachian, as I mentioned, my mother was born in Choctaw, Tennessee, in Hawkins County. I was raised as a child in a small village in the Niger Delta, in the heart of what is also another of the world's extractive zones for the global economy, where oil has been extracted for years with deep impacts, like in Appalachia, on land, environment, and people. While I lived and worked for many years in Appalachia with the Vanderbilt Student Health Coalition, the Highlander Center, the University of Tennessee, for the last almost 30 years, I've been based at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK, where I continue to work on issues of power, inequality, and social change, mainly in other rural parts of the world as well. So all this is a rather long-winded introduction, what my mother would call the clearing the throat time, that brings me to the topic for this evening. The theme of the conference is Rural Reimagined, a grand challenge for Appalachia. Picking up on the theme, I've titled my remarks, Rural Appalachia in Global Context, Reimagining a Just and Sustainable Future. Now I choose this for several reasons. First, rural Appalachia for over 100 years has been shaped by a global extractive economy, which in turn has shaped patterns of power and development. There are many, many rural regions in the world who are shaped by similar forces. We are part of a global context. Secondly, rural Appalachia, which has seen many economic transitions across its history, is now at another critical juncture, one characterized by the decline of fossil fuel economy, driven by the need to address the urgency of climate change. Such transition is having and will have enormous impacts on our region, whose history has been shaped by coal extraction as well, but it's also having similar impacts in other extractive zones of the world. So while on the one hand, this transition risks reinforcing patterns of development based on inequality and injustice, on the other hand, I want to suggest that it is in the midst of transition that we can also reimagine a more just and sustainable future. I realize as I speak that in the United States we are also in the midst of a political turmoil and political transition, where for many of us our imaginations of the future are being trampled upon, and where the progressive policies from which many of us have fought for many years to protect our land and people are being dismantled. But it is now more than ever, I want to argue, that reimagining the world is most critical. Such reimagining doesn't need to be wishful dreaming, but it can drive our actions to shape our region's future. So in pursuing this theme of reimagining the world in global context, I first want to talk briefly about where we come from, reflecting on the contributions of Appalachian study over the last 48 years. Then I want to discuss further what I believe are the two critical issues of our time: inequality and transition in the face of climate change, and link these to how they manifest themselves in Appalachia. And finally, I want to conclude by talking further about how we reimagine the world in these difficult times. So in 1978, when I addressed the first Appalachian Studies Conference in Berea, I talked with rather boldly titled, "Which Side Are You On? Inequality in the Appalachian Studies Industry." I began the talk by challenging perceptions of Appalachia as a region of poverty. No, Appalachia is not poor, I said, but her people scarcely benefit from her wealth. Appalachia is not underdeveloped, but development fails the average Appalachian. We needed to shift our gaze, I argued, away from poverty to the problem of inequality. Now, being brash and young, I went on to discuss how the inequalities translated into knowledge inequalities, in which the people of the region and the universities of the region neither produce nor control the information which could shape how we understood and acted upon these issues. I argue that Appalachian colleges and universities at that time had failed to produce critical studies of Appalachian issues, or to be a source of resistance against the region's exploitation. On this last point, I'm very happy to say that the last 48 years have proven me wrong. The Appalachian field of Appalachian studies has mushroomed over the decades, and with it the Appalachian Studies Conference. In 2003, at the 25th meeting, I congratulated the conference saying, "I do not know of any other professional association in all my travels that can claim such a record of bringing together activists and scholars in such a dynamic and creative way in a single region or over a 25-year history." I certainly can't think of one that starts the initial session as it did last night with banjo and fiddle playing. As the Appalachian Studies Conference approaches its 50th year, I want to say this even louder. The vibrancy and the transdisciplinarity which brings together activists, artists, and scholars, the creativity and activism of the conference have been a joy to watch and occasionally to participate in directly. One of the ways we can measure the contributions of Appalachian Studies is to look at its content, what it studies, what it says. 50 years ago, just 3 years before the conference in 1978, I had extensively reviewed the literature for my PhD, like a good PhD student does. And that book was later become the book Power and Powerlessness. And over the last 3 years, I've been revisiting that work with Katie Schwartzman from the University of Tennessee. And we have a new book forthcoming, which I'll say more about in a moment. And as part of that revisit, I was once again able to revisit the literature of the region and to compare how it changed over half a century. I'm struck by several trends. First, the sheer abundance of published material. When I did my dissertation 50 years ago, there of course some more critical sources. Titles like Night Comes to the Cumberlands by Harry Caudle or Yesterday's People by Jack Lower stood out. But they gave somewhat individualistic or cultural explanations of the region. The book Colonialism in Modern America, edited by Helen Lewis, Linda Johnson, and Don Ashton, which gave us a more structured explanation, was only published in 1978, the year the Appalachian Studies Conference was founded. But by now, of course, there are thousands of sources about the region. There are dozens of published bibliographies. There are numbers of courses and university programs. There are 850 people here at this conference and other Appalachian conferences. The sheer quantity of scholarship has been impressive. But it's equally important to me are some of the important shifts in what is studied and how we understand the region. Now here, if I were to name authors, I would leave people out, so with apologies, I'll be very broad. But 3 or 4 trends stand out to me. First, building on the colonialism theme, which continues to be debated, we now have a series of accounts of the political economy of the region, which help us to understand its development not only in cultural and individualistic terms, as the unfortunate hillbilly elegy by J.D. Vance still tries to do, but allows us to look more deeply at how capitalist economic forces, many of which are predatory and extractive, have helped to shape the development of the region. Secondly, 50 years ago, there was little account of the racial and ethnic diversities of the region. It was known as a white region with white poverty But today we now have multiple rich accounts of African American history in the region, as well as Native and Indigenous history and more. Recent work on queer Appalachia and on gendered identities have also helped to challenge the assumed stereotypes of what to be Appalachian means. Third one, of course, there have been many important moments of organizing and resistance. In 1950 years ago, there was very little documentation of those. But today we have wonderful historical and contemporary accounts of mobilizations, including within the labor movement, community organizing, queer organizing, anti-strip mining, innovative community development work, popular education work, participatory research, and the list could go on. We understand the important role of women in leading many of these movements, countering also the image of women as lacking agency in what was often understood as a predominantly masculine culture. Finally, of course, we have a wealth of knowledge documenting the rich culture of the region, found in music, language, arts, all of which also help counter dominant received stereotypes, such as the Beverly Hillbillies image of early years. I could go on, but wow, these are incredible contributions over 5 decades, which have contributed to our shifts in how we understand the region, and which we should, of course, collectively celebrate. But within this rich history of scholarship, there's one theme that I want to interrogate further tonight, around which within Appalachia there's always seemed to be a little ambivalence and actually a little bit of tension. This has to do with how Appalachian studies places the region and itself in relationship to the rest of the world. On the one hand, there has been a tendency sometimes to focus inward on Appalachia as a unique region, perhaps exceptional or different to the other parts of the world, and we want to celebrate the uniqueness of Appalachia. But on the other hand, particularly over recent years, there's also been a strand of Appalachian studies that have always argued that we must understand the region not in isolation, but as part of a broader national or global economic order. Deeply affected by it, often exploited by it. In their 1977 Guide to Appalachian Studies, for instance, Walls and Billings argued that the analysis of the region often understood it as a peripheral region within an advanced capitalist society, and I could go on, many of you have written about that in recent years. But today, I think this tension between the regional and the global may still be present. I want to add a little nuance to the argument. First, I think we've learned that in a globally interconnected world, we need to go beyond the dichotomies of insiders versus outsiders, or of looking inwards or looking outwards. In order to understand where we sit and how to link to a broader world, we do have to understand ourselves and our region. But a local perspective that stops at the local will always be limited and partial in the global and interconnected world. Similarly, though, a global analysis which fails to understand and appreciate the local and regional knowledge will also be partial and will be at risk of creating hollow stereotypes of the other without understanding local realities. So rather than dichotomize, we need an Appalachian studies that can do both, that can deepen our knowledge of place, and from that perspective, look outward and connect with others similarly placed in the global economy. I also want to suggest that even though while we thought of ourselves as a peripheral region within a global economy, that view too is limited. The image of periphery still suggests a region that is apart from the mainstream, that it is an exception, that it is not a reflection of the wider pattern. No, I want to argue that more than ever, the region is not one left behind or on the periphery, but rather its patterns of development simply illustrate or manifest patterns which are at the heart of, at the center of, global development. In this sense, we can understand the region not as a periphery, but more as a canary in the mine that has detected and illustrated failures of a global development model earlier than many other parts of the world, and in other places that are not so close to the coal face. What is unique about the region is not the patterns of inequality and exclusion that we have seen, but the fact that we saw them more visibly and perhaps earlier. before they became apparent in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So let me make this argument, if you can bear with me, on relationship to two contemporary issues of our time: the rise of global inequality and the need to face climate change, and particularly the transition away from a coal economy. Though it's always been with us, in recent years the challenge of extreme inequality has emerged as a central one across the world. Not only NGOs and activists, but leaders at Davos, the IMF, the World Bank have proclaimed it as one of the leading development challenges of our time. Looking globally, the gap between the global haves and the global have-nots is greater than at any time in recent history. In recent months, the issue of extreme inequality has also gained attention within U.S. politics, as Elon Musk, the world's richest man, and other techno-billionaires emerge on the public stage more visibly. But what we are now seeing more clearly in the U.S. simply reflects a global pattern. Without jumping off the statistical deep end, let me just give you a couple of slides. According to the Oxfam report in 2019, they do an annual global inequality report, the world's billionaires, then only 2,000 people, owned more than the bottom 4.6 billion people in the world. The combined wealth of the world's 22 richest men, and they aren't mainly men, was more than the wealth of all of the women in Africa put together. The latest Oxfam report, released in January, shows that these patterns have become even more extreme over the last 5 years. Meanwhile, the number of people living in poverty globally has remained about the same since 1990. And in the United States, we see what happens. Over the last decade, the wealth concentration of the top 17 richest Americans doubled, moving from 1% to 2% of the U.S. wealth, while the wealth of the ordinary Americans remained stagnant or went down. In his 2020 book, Poverty by America, Pulitzer Prize-winning author Matthew Desmond observes that the United States still has more poverty than any other advanced democracy in the world. 1 in 7 Americans live below the poverty line, despite living in the richest country on earth. The growth of inequality is not simply an economic issue, but it has huge impacts on other aspects of well-being. In 2016, I was privileged to serve as one of the coordinators and editors of the World Social Science Report on Inequality, published by UNESCO. In that report, contribution after contribution from scholars and activists around the world showed how economic inequalities shape and contribute to other inequalities. Social inequalities around health and education, environmental inequalities around access to water or clean air, spatial inequalities between rural and urban areas, cultural inequalities, including those around race and gender, knowledge inequalities around what information is produced for whom and who has access to it. A particular note, in what we're seeing so manifestly visible in the United States now, is the relationship between extreme economic inequality and extreme inequalities of political power. As Robert Reich, the former U.S. Secretary of Labor, put it recently, concentrated power promotes concentrated wealth, just as concentrated wealth promotes concentrated power. The two are symbiotic, leading Reich, Biden, and others to warn of an emerging oligarchy in the United States that threatens our democracy, while others have argued that such concentrated power has long been with us. It's now simply becoming more brazen and more visible. But hang on, Gaventa, you might ask, what does all this have to do with Appalachia? What does it have to do with Appalachian studies? Well, almost everything, I would argue. Since that first Appalachian Studies meeting, many scholars and activists have understood the region also as one of poverty amidst massive wealth, much of which left the region just as the wealth from the global south was drained from the global south through colonial and extractive forms of development. Indeed, the Appalachian land ownership study and many other studies show how in our region how economic inequality creates an intersection with other forms of inequality. Be they environmental inequalities around decades of strip mining or open cast or toxic waste dumping, toxic tax inequalities that affect education, roads, services, health inequalities of who can create access care, but also how predatory drug companies could target those ill and in pain to create addiction, the deepening of racial and gender inequalities, and more. All of these are part of Appalachian studies. And in terms of power inequalities, we are long familiar in Appalachia with how corporate power has shaped and controlled political power. We have a legacy most strongly in company towns, where the distinction between the political and the economic was scarcely discernible. Oligarchy, government by the few, especially despotic power exercised by a small and privileged group, is not new to us. It's not new to the political economy of the region. Look at the recent elections, where we're talking about in one session today, the closeness of our governors and representatives to economic power. Rising inequality is linked in other parts of the world to the rise of right-wing authoritarianism, a phenomenon with which we also have become all too familiar. Despite the fact that over 50 years the failed development model, the ARC has poured $14.5 billion for economic development to the region, these inequalities have persisted and deepened. And while ARC was busily pouring money into the region, at the same time broader economic and market forces were taking it away. For instance, a study by the Rand Institute calculates that between 1975, just before we held the first Appalachian Studies meeting, and 2018, almost $50 trillion in taxable income was redistributed away from the bottom 90% of Americans, where the majority of Appalachians would no doubt sit, to the very wealthy, to the top 10%, making America the most unequal country amidst its Western counterparts. In their 2023 book, The Injustice of Place, Schaefer, Eden, and Nelson remind us that poverty is best understood in relationship to place. For it is in a single place that the multiple intersecting disadvantages of relationships can be seen. Going beyond war on poverty metrics, which were based largely on income, they construct a more holistic index of deep disadvantage. Applying this to over 3,000 counties and cities across America, they found that the most disadvantaged places on this scale, no surprise, were in rural America, not in cities, including Appalachia, no surprise, but also the Hispanic Latinx populated area along the South Texas border, the Cotton Belt, often known as the Black Belt, across southern U.S., and Native American communities. Their analysis found that these separate parts of America had one thing in common: a history of intensive resource extraction and profound human exploitation not seen to the same degree elsewhere in the United States. So far from being the other America, which caught the attention of Kennedy and Johnson in the 1960s, today we stand with vast swathes of rural America who face similar challenges. What is exceptional and different today, again I argue, is not inequality in Appalachia, but the patterns of inequality that we have now long seen and felt are now very much part of mainstream America. Rather than a region left behind, to borrow a description from the past, Appalachia simply illustrates unequal patterns of development that we see now across the nation and across the world. Extreme inequality. Let's go on to another big challenge. Runaway inequality is often linked deeply to another global crisis, the climate crisis, brought on by carbon emissions. This too is an inequality issue. 10% of the world's population contribute to almost half of the world's carbon emissions, while the bottom 50% of the population are only responsible for 12% of the world's carbon emissions. Globally, the urgent need to shift away from fossil fuels in the face of climate change is now widely recognized. In the historic COP26 meetings in Glasgow 4 years ago, a coalition of 190 countries and organizations signed up to phase out coal power and to end new investments in coal. A press release by the UN framework boldly announced coal is being consigned to history as countries, banks, and organizations move away from the single biggest contributor to climate change. Now, while the transition away from fossil fuels is critical for the planet, we also know they will have huge impacts on the communities who have long relied on fossil fuel extraction for their livelihoods. And once again, whether it be on the periphery of this change, the coal mining regions of Appalachia have been at the front lines of this transition. In 1984, over 68,000 miners were employed in Central Appalachia. By 2023, this number has dwindled to 11,000 miners. Between 2005 to 2020, mining employment in the region fell by over 80%. In Upper East Tennessee, once an important mining region, all of the mines are now closed. Company towns where Miles Horton cut his teeth like Walter, where he was arrested, have long been gone. But Appalachia is by no means alone in this global transition. In the western United States, coal mining communities are also continuing with rapid transition away from mining. Globally, according to the World Bank, over the last 50 years, changes in the coal industry in Europe, the United States, and Canada have resulted in over 4 million coal miners losing their jobs. In countries in the global south, in places like Indonesia, South Africa, India, or Colombia, coal mining closures are having huge impacts, often on poor communities and populations. So it's in this context that it's critical that we both understand more deeply what impact such transitions have on places whose history, livelihoods, identities, politics, and social structures have been shaped by over a century of the fuel-based economy, this fossil fuel-based economy, places like Central Appalachia. So with this in mind, Dave Schwartzen and I just recently completed this forthcoming manuscript, there's some flyers up here, called Power and Just Transition, Struggles for a Post-Coal Future in Appalachian Valley. By focusing on a single place, the Clear Fork Valley, we try to get some answers to these global questions. Now, much has been written on the impact of coal's decline on jobs and services and communities, but our focus wasn't just on the socioeconomic effects. We also wanted to ask what happens to power relations as the industry which had so much power declines. And here's some important themes emerge which we feel have wider global relevance. We've learned that even though the economic base may change, the mines closed, that doesn't mean that the power relations that those mine companies have built have gone away. As we now see with the fossil fuel industry more broadly, the powerful interests, in this case the coal industry, struggle to hold on. In the case of Appalachia, to try to clean the power, they first of all made concerted efforts to weaken any countervailing power. Gradually weakening, for instance, the once powerful United Mine Workers in the region, and discrediting other protesters. Secondly, they worked to cling on to the political base and the political oligarchy in which they had built. It's instructive that as coal production in the region went down, the donations of the coal industry to conservative, pro-coal, anti-climate change politicians in Washington went up enormously. The industry invested huge amounts in trying to protect an old status quo, including spending millions around the narrative of coal, such as the pro-coal campaigns, such as Friends of Coal, and then later the millions they spent on what they called the people leading the war on coal. Now, what happened in Appalachia as coal barons worked to hold on to their power, again, isn't an isolated case. Rather, it was a strategy right out of a larger playbook we now see as the global fossil fuel industry tries to hold on to its power, clamping down on forces who dare to challenge the industry, such as we saw in the recent Greenpeace case, spending billions to maintain its alliance with those in political power, while also spending billions to shape the narrative of how burning fossil fuels is necessary for the world's future. Indeed, after its enormous contributions of over $10 billion to the Trump campaign, the industry was awarded with the appointment of an Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, a former oil and gas executive who was on record as saying, there is no climate crisis, and we're not in the midst of an energy transition, and who spouts the narrative that the further extraction of fossil fuels is what is necessary to lift people out of poverty. Regulation after regulation are being rolled back that will once again strengthen the power of the fossil fuel industry. Now, as the coal industry has declined, we've also seen something else. we've seen new actors enter the region to extract the region's resources in new ways. Again, the Clear Fork Valley that I studied many years ago is an example. Here the former coal lands, which were owned by the American Association, a British company, which featured in my American book, now as gauge work has shown, these lands are now owned by a very different type of actor, a private equity firm called NatureVest, which is linked to and controlled by the Nature Conservancy, the world's largest environmental NGO. Now owning, Nature Conservancy now owns over 400 square miles of Central Appalachia, but it doesn't mine coal. But it has attracted millions in new investments with the promise of a return to the investors for climate change mitigation, carbon offsets, and conservation easements, which means the lands turn to recreational lands so that local people who used to be able to freely roam the land now have to get a license to hunt and fish in their own homelands. Carbon credits sold on the California carbon market, and Appalachia now is the largest supplier in the world to the California carbon market, where you gain credit simply by not cutting down trees as fast, allow companies in other parts of the country and the world simply to pollute more freely elsewhere. So this is a new form of investment coming into Appalachia, and it's not unique. It's linked to green grabbing approaches we see again around the world. Even the Nature Conservancy says very openly to us that what they're doing is part of a global project. Their project in Appalachia is described by them as a grand experiment, also carried out in the Brazilian Amazon, the Kenyan Highlands, and the Borneo Forest, to demonstrate that conservation and profit can go together. But despite the laudable goals for people living near the land, there are few benefits and little voice to be seen in this new form of development. Now, while these findings may all seem a bit bleak, old power, new actors coming in, at the same time, the need to transition from fossil fuels to other forms of energy has also led to calls and social movements for this to be a more just transition, one that also creates more equitable, sustainable, and inclusive forms of development. The phrase just transition was only used once in the Paris Agreement in 2015, but by this year, the phrase is widely used in global discourse, and like many buzzwords in development, is already viewed by many somewhat cynically. Somebody asked me today, Maureen, give me an example of a just transition. So how do we give meaning to this challenge? How do we assure that the future is more just and sustainable than the past? The group Movement Generation put it this way: an economy based on extracting from a finite system faster than the capacity of the system to regenerate will come to an end. Transition is inevitable, but justice is not. So for communities whose very economic, social, and political structures have been built around coal, this transition, of course, doesn't simply refer to a technical process. It's not a matter of replacing one source of energy to another source of energy. It involves necessarily how we will transform the forms of social, economic, political, and ideological power that has shaped our communities for over a century. But we should remember that this isn't the first structural transition or transformation in our history. The first might be seen in the encounters of indigenous communities and settler economies, as we heard so eloquently last night from the American Indian Movement leader who welcomed us. A second was around the 1890s, when a largely agricultural area was transformed by the extractive fossil fuel economy that over 100 years built its power and control. But now, as the coal industry weakens, we're once again seeing massive changes in the socio-economic base of the region. And within that change, new struggles for power will emerge. In our book, we argue that the current period represents a critical moment. We borrow from the Italian activist and theorist Antonio Gramsci, who also wrote around the time of the rise of fascism in Italy in the early 1920s. And we argue that what we are seeing is what he called the interregnum, The interregnum is the time between when one order is receding and a new form of power and hegemony is emerging. But that's a messy period where the patterns are not so clear. He wrote that the crisis consists precisely because of the fact that the old is dying and the new hasn't yet been born, that during this interregnum a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And indeed, one could perhaps argue that some of the dramatic events of the last few months in Washington, as the fossil fuel lobby attempts to hold on to its hegemony in a fraught coalition with techno-billionaires and right-wing nationalistic forces, is a representation of some of these morbid symptoms of change. But though these past power holders struggle to hold on, and new power holders are emerging, so too are new opportunities emerging, where relatively powerless groups can mobilize to make their voices heard. And we have in the Appalachian region, as we try to make our voices heard, we have many strengths from which we can draw. We can start with assets. We're not starting with a poor region, we're starting with a region that has experience in dealing with transition. First, in sharp contrast, we're already experiencing the effects of climate change, on top of the history of destructive land use practices and mountaintop removal. But whether in response to the floods of eastern Kentucky in 2022 or 2025, or to the recent devastating effects of Hurricane Helene in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia, we have seen enormous social and cultural capital as neighbors who had little reached out to others who had even less. A rich history of organizing and documentation led by groups like Appleshop and others, or the emergence of mining and Black history museums or other forms of memory work have helped us to document, protect, and strengthen this social and cultural resilience, leaving us with a resource upon which we can build. Secondly, as we briefly touched upon, Appalachia also has a strong history of organizing resistance already around transition issues. Within Appalachia, any efforts to imagine a just and future must begin by dealing with the injustices of the past, including the legacies of land, destruction of land and water. And over the last decades, we've seen movements for environmental justice emerge, whether the Save and Land the People movement in the 1960s and 70s, or the development of vibrant grass organizations like SOCM and KFTC, or the movement against mountaintop removal, as we heard about in the wonderful workshop today. Unlike some other periods, these groups are also linked together through coalitions like the Alliance for Appalachia, who are able to amplify local voices to national debates. Third, perhaps because of the very vacuum of economic and political solutions brought by policymakers, we also have a long history of people in the region creating and testing their own small-scale alternatives, be they community clinics, land trusts, economic cooperatives, shelters, or more. The region is alive with such examples of creating alternatives, all of which, though often small scale, serve as precursors to help us imagine what a different kind of development could be. Now, in the past, while the region was rich in such initiatives, oftentimes these were separate and uncoordinated, with work on culture work or community organizing or economic development, often seen as somewhat separate strategies. And in the period of working here, we've often worked in our own silos. And yet, under the banner of just transition, of building a more just and sustainable future, all of these must come together. And indeed, often they are. A recent academic study of initiatives between 2010 and 2020 identified within Central Appalachia alone over 70 civil society organizations working on issues of coal industry accountability, remediating past damage, stopping the expansion of fossil fuels, or developing alternatives. The study argues it's because the states and governments have failed Appalachia and the industry has been hostile to such alternatives that by necessity such rich civil society and community-based networks have emerged to fill the void and make us better positioned in many parts of the world to face new crises. For a brief period under the Biden administration, the long history of the work at the grassroots had the opportunity to link to new policy initiatives at the national level. We saw new federal initiatives under the banner of economic and environmental justice that promised to bring the greatest inflow of federal resources into the region since the War on Poverty. And like the War on Poverty's clause of maximum feasible participation, Biden's Justice 40 directive mandated that many of these resources should go directly to the energy communities most affected, creating a new window to link the organizing energy from below to large-scale national policies. But just as we saw the War on Poverty's mandate for maximum feasible participation of the poor was short-lived, so has this window. In the new administration, these top-down initiatives for environmental and economic justice were the first to go. And all the pages that even talked about them on the White House webpage, you can no longer find. They've been erased from our history. Now, while this, of course, can feel like a setback, many of you worked on many interesting projects and proposals, we have to remember that we have been here before. Despite its brevity, the maximum feasible participation mandate in the War on Poverty also stimulated new forms of action and mobilizing, often giving rise to new leaders and new organizations. And when the policy window closed, the energy and activism still continued, with ripples being felt in many communities, still felt to this day. While funds can be taken away and political spaces can be closed, the imaginations for a brighter future which they unleash will be hard to rebuy. So that then brings us in conclusion to the importance of reimagining, the theme of the conference. How we reimagine the world, especially in tough times. In my first book on power and powerlessness, drawing on the ideas of political theorist Stephen Lewis, I argued as he had that the greatest form of power was the power to shape and control our ideas and beliefs, to shape our imaginations, to make sure that we accepted an unjust status quo rather than to challenge it. This approach was later challenged, rightfully now I believe, I got it wrong I think, by the late Yale sociologist James Scott, who argued that no system of power has ever been created that could keep people from imagining that life could be different. As he wrote, the millennial theme of a world turned upside down, a world in which the last shall be first and the first shall be last, can be found in nearly every cultural tradition in which inequities of power, wealth, and status have been pronounced. The obstacles to resistance are many, he said, but they are not attributable to the inability of subordinate groups to imagine a counterfactual social order. He says you can never take away that ability to imagine. Now, over the years, I've thought a lot about Scott's critique, and I actually believe that my earlier work, Power and Powerless work, overstated what I call quiescence in the face of inequality, and understated the rich history of resistance and popular imagination in the region, which has only continued to rise in the last 50 years as the power of the fossil fuel industry has receded. In this movement to build alternatives, a number of scholars have written about the importance of a new kind of power, what they call the power forward. That is the power to imagine and articulate a new narrative for the future. In moments of systematic transformation, we argue, such propositional power is all the more important as it imagines the future while building on the oppositional forms of action which we have used in the past. How then can we imagine such a future at this critical moment in history? Already that work is well underway. As minds have closed, a number of efforts have already emerged to listen to people's ideas of what they want to create for a new future, be they the listening projects of KFDC and the Alliance for Appalachia, or the work of Highlanders Appalachian Transition Fellowship Program, from which they developed a vision for transformation. In other rural extractive zones around the world where our institute is currently working, where I'm working, we see similar initiatives. In Colombia, a major coal-producing country, has now courageously banned new fossil fuel production. And there we see citizens groups coming together to consciously build a a new narrative from below, drawn on local and indigenous values and visions to counter the dominant discrediting rhetoric which the fossil fuel industry is now pushing on Colombia to say that you can't survive without us. In the Niger Delta, where I was raised, local groups are demanding voices in the nation's new National Just Transition Plan, built on a vision that there can be no just transition to the future without also restorative justice, which cleans up the destruction of land and livelihoods the oil companies have left in the past. Very important for Appalachia. And in Zimbabwe and Brazil, where massive lithium mines are now being opened to provide critical new minerals for a post-carbon world, we simply see replication of historic patterns of extraction and destruction. And there are activists that who I've interviewed recently reminds us that a process which closes the fossil fuel mines in one place, while simply beginning to destroy the future of another place, is not a just transition at all. Indeed, around the world, as in Appalachia, social movements are demanding environmental, climate, and economic justice, and many communities and workers are organizing for new forms of decentralized, sustainable energy production and other industries. So while we and others are imagining and fighting for this post-fossil fuel world, of course it's to be expected that dominant forces will try any way they can to suppress and discredit our imaginations and our actions. We've shown in our book that power doesn't give way easily. It clings to hold on. So yes, we are in a difficult moment where it appears that our work for a new future is facing major setbacks in countless ways. And it can be discouraging, and I've heard people here talk about that. What difference did all that activism make when we see it being wiped out in short periods of time? In such a moment, I take heart from the imagery of peaks and valleys that Miles Horton at Highlander often shared with us. When we on the staff sometimes got discouraged, he would remind us that though Highlander was often best known for its contributions to key movements like the Civil Rights Movement, these were the peak moments in which forces for change were aligned. He said more important, but less recognized, was the work that Highlander did during the valley periods, when times were tough. It was in these periods that new ideas could be tried, that new leaders and organizations could emerge, that new imaginaries could be formed, to be ready for when the next opportunity to scale the peak came along. So in the longer historical arc towards a post-coal future, there will be peaks and valleys along the way. As a mountainous region and a mountain people, we know well about peaks and valleys, not just topographically, but also in terms of our own political, economic, and social history. Yet counter to stereotypes that depicted a region of desolation or backwardness, Appalachian studies and scholarship have taught us that even in the valley moments, even in the midst of tough times and hard places, we are a region of resistance, resilience, and visions for different models of development and change. We've also learned that the peaks and valleys of our region, while unique in many ways, do not stand alone. We are deeply connected through climate forces as well as economic forces to other rural parts of the world who are also now at a crossroads, at a transition point in which they face the new future. In such an interconnected world, as the field of Appalachian studies approaches its half-century mark, we should, of course, continue to document and celebrate our own rich and resilient culture and history. But we can also, with confidence in who we are, broaden and look outwards to join in solidarity with activists and scholars in other similarly affected parts of the globe, to contribute our knowledge and experiences to them while learning from their experiences as well. So as we look to the future from this position of a globally aware regional studies community, let us not do so through thinking of ourselves as a region set apart, or left behind, or on the periphery, In fact, we are at the front lines of some of the most critical challenges of our time. And from these front lines, from the coalface, we can, together with others, build on our rich knowledge and action to imagine and fight for a just and sustainable future. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a few moments and Dr. Gaventa is going to take some questions. So raise your hand if you have questions.
Or comments? And please introduce yourself.
Howdy, I'm Dylan Harris.
Hi, John. Nice to meet you.
Just a quick question. So, something you touched on is very inspiring, right? We're in the midst of a just transition. None of it's done yet, right? There's a lot of interventions, a lot of things to move. Given the kind of lack of federal funding to Justice 40 initiatives specifically, so many of the DOE grants that are funding carbon storage, hydrogen hubs, forest carbon offsets, all of that work's actually still happening, just the community benefits part's been cut, right? That's DEI, ensuring jobs, right? Given your experience over the past, 50 years, what can we do despite that, right? What are organizations that exist? What are patterns of resistance, not just power and powerlessness, that can respond to this moment where the research on how to do this stuff is still happening, but that is it a good idea research is not happening. But we can still do that, right? It's just the funding streams have been cut. So what does that look like, and how can we tap into that?
A great question, and I don't fully know how to answer it. Those cuts have been made, but as I said, they can't take away from the ideas and the energy that people had already begun mobilizing. And I think the key thing we need to keep in mind is not to equate our possibility of agency with federal funding. If we think we can't act without funding, then no change would ever have happened here in the first place. That funding was only ever promised because of 50 years of struggle to put Appalachian issues on the global table. And if they take it away, it will slow us down. But I do believe that we're on the arc, as I say, of a longer history of change, where we are facing setback cliffs. There are thousands of communities around the world who are still struggling for something in the future, and we need to make sure, it's easy for me to say, that it doesn't become so discouraged that we stop that fight. And as Mao would say, we simply need to shift our target, to go back to some of the basics of organizing, of creating a little alternatives, of trying to get what funding we can. Gabe and I had to rewrite the book, the forthcoming book, after the election. And in the last couple of days, we're rewriting it again. Because we kind of optimistically thought that even though we knew Trump would cut this back, that already that funding would be reaching to many conservative districts and Congress and so on, and they would fight to hold on to it. And of course, we are now understanding that he's ignoring them as well. But it also means there are now more allies with people who are going to be mad. And we have to therefore rethink who our possible allies are, because other folks that we didn't in the past see as allies are having their interests trampled upon also. So I think it's a time for serious reflection on new strategies, but not for giving up, which of course is so easy to want to do.
Hi, my name is John Nemeth, and I want all young people to be encouraged and not discouraged like I am. I have watched in the last 90 days 55 years of professional science and engineering go down the drain. From radon to endangered plants. things that I've worked in. And so I'm in a bad mood now. But, short of armed insurrection, okay, short of that, for now, I've heard in your talk, and this is great, I've heard the kernels of some action plan. There's an action plan in there. There's 3 or 4 things that can be done. There's 70 organizations that are doing great things. They ought to do one great thing. Okay? Their objectives are the same. So I guess the challenge is for an organization like this, we're all going to continue to teach. That's one action plan, right? That's a long-term action. What can we do as a region, and who will lead the region to figure out what are the 3 most important things we can do right now to overcome this wave of fascism? And so I think the steering committee of this organization ought to look for that action plan. What are those things that we need to do, young and old, that will turn the tide? You know, we can talk about how bad it is and how wonderful we are and how great the past was and how wonderful the future will be, but we're in a crisis right now. And so we actually need to have an action plan that is going to do something, that's going to turn that tide. I agree, we can do it, but we're going to have to actually do it.
And I think you do it by beginning to talk about it. And today, for instance, I know that there was a great workshop I didn't get to go on fascism and anti-fascism in Appalachia. It's on the agenda of this conference, which is great. And as I say, you have so many resources to build upon. You know, there are many organizers in this room who are beginning to have that conversation, to think about that conversation. And so I think that I would just say there's 2 things. It's not going to be a quick fix. We have to retreat again for another long haul. But let's start with what we have built and recognizing that, and we're starting from scratch.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Paul Ray from the University of Alabama. As we sit back to reimagine and to sort of retrench and find new ways, you talk about how we're part of a global version of this. So what are some lessons that we can learn from other parts of the world? We can look back at our own history, we can look back at our own, the memory work, we can see where we have been and what we have done. What are some things that we can take from other parts of the world that are doing the same thing, that they're having to fight some of the same battles that we are now facing, places that had more overt forms of fascism, that are, you know, these types of really repressive governments? What are some lessons that we can learn from them, because we are all part of this community, the local and the global?
I don't want to understate the challenges that everybody's facing.
Right.
But I do get inspiration when I'm in other parts of the world. Just to say a little bit more about this work in Colombia now. Think about this, a coal-dependent country whose president had the courage to say, we will be the first in the world to stop coal. And the first to sign was called the Global Non-Proliferation of Fossil Fuel Treaty. And you can imagine the kickback he's now getting from big companies and new governments around the world. What they have done is very deliberately sit down and say, rather than just believe what those companies are telling us and believe what the media says, let's document the misinformation we're getting, and let's do that systematically. They've had a national project of participatory research where local communities are documenting the narratives that are being driven from below, and then saying, let's bring people together to think about our narratives. But in doing that, we have to come together in new alliances. So the second thing is the crisis is such that we can't remain in our same camps, writing out our specific issues that we've done for so long. Because people say when the tough gets going that the grass gets taller, that the grassroots become bigger, right? So we have to find new allies of so many different organizations, energy groups, climate groups, anti-mining groups, fossil fuel groups, alternative economic groups, to now come together around this common vision and not stay in our own key silos. So those two things, reimagining through conscious narrative building and consciously broadening the allies, the alliances of people who work together, because we are similarly affected now in bigger ways than we ever knew to do that. Hey, George.
I'm George Posey. In 1961, when I walked on my first picket line at a segregated laundromat in East Tennessee, my hometown, the people who honked were against us. The day before I came here, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs came to Asheville's VA hospital, and a group of us were protesting in front of the VA hospital. Never in any demonstration I've been on, and that's the Capitol, have so many pickup trucks honked in support of us. The bus drivers driving city buses with passengers honked at us. The organ man with his truck that said organ on it honked at us. Other people with city cars, driving city cars, honked at us. And the previous week, our Republican representative came to a town hall, and estimates were that between 2,000 and 3,000 people came to his town hall to protest. And so we are at a time right now that I have never seen in my life, where there is a much more widespread support for social action. And that means that our audience is much greater than it's ever been.
Thanks, George. It's great to hear, and I've been hearing similar stories. I've been visiting friends back in the U.S. recent days. And I guess the challenge is, going back to my argument of, where's the vision that will give that anger a place to go? Because to me, the critical count, anger misguided, if we learn from history, the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany, can easily be manipulated by one sort of vision, unless there's an alternative which can be put on the table. And that's where we have to collectively build, and that's where we're seeing a huge vacuum in the country, except for a few people, I think. And that's something that we can all start to do together. Anybody can help think about a new vision for what they want to do.
I don't need the mic. I think I need to just remind the crowd, and I think we've all seen this, that Mother Nature is an ally participating in ways that she has not. For example, in the Weimar period, which fascism reared its ugly head, the level of and strength of communitarian care for each other across the political spectrum was on display in northwestern North Carolina in a way that I have not seen in my life. I think we neglect the lessons and making positive use and reaching out across the multitude of divisions. We neglect an opportunity if we don't point out that she is saying, I am mad and I'm not going to put up with it. Just a thought.
Yes.
I'm Flo Auerbach from East Tennessee State University, and unlike many of the people in this room, I'm in healthcare, and I'm a nurse. So I know that we're talking about place, but we can't have place without people, and we can't have activism without help. So where in your wisdom does the misinformation that's going on around health, what's available, vaccines, all of the above, we have a measles outbreak going on. Where does health play in this? And is that a potential organizer to be able to bring people together? Because it's a human condition that all of us have.
Well, we've got a lot of people sitting up here that you need to be talking to. We've been health organizers for many years, and that's where we got our start together some 50 years ago. Yes, absolutely. Health is something that affects everybody, and therefore it's something around which we can collectively organize. And health in many parts of the world is being reinterpreted, as I think it is here, not simply to mean physical health, but a just transition also has to repair the health traumas of the past, of which have destroyed physical health, mental health, community well-being. And so I know of many activist groups, for instance, the women groups in Southern Africa, who are now focusing a lot on self-care as a fundamental basis for social action. And many of us for many years said, no, we believe in social movements, we'll just sacrifice for self-care. We're not going to take care of ourselves. But I see that a shift in that understanding in many parts of the world. That if we don't care for ourselves in a social movement, social action, we aren't caring for the world. What you do about the disinformation that you're talking about, and that I think is new for the last 50 years. We've always had disinformation in the region, but never at the scale and ability to be algorithmically promoted than we're facing to do. That is a huge new challenge. And the only way I know how to fix it is through authentic, going back to the basics, authentic people to people, trying to correct some of the things that we're hearing. But that is a global challenge of this, the communication of misinformation. It's scary. Not a great answer, but it's just...
Any other questions? Thank you, Dr. Gaventa. Thank you. Dr. Gaventa will be signing copies of Time on Powerlessness. Also, we have a community event downtown in Cookeville at First Presbyterian Church. We're having a bluegrass band called the Bilberries. I'd encourage you to come see. So, thank you.